Hello, Econ students. This is Mr. Stark. We are ready to start Standard 5, which is a fairly large standard. It covers big topics such as inflation, gross domestic product. Um, it covers things like the unemployment rate, poverty, some really big issues we're going to be talking about. Um, and hopefully you are doing well. Now, one of the things I did not get to do too much with you all was share some jokes that my 6-year-old, now 6 years old, has come up with. One of them I'm going to tell you now. He just came up with today, actually. So hopefully this brings a smile to your face. Now, keep in mind this is not my joke. So before you send me virtual eye rolls, this is my 6-year-old. But the joke goes like this. Um, when two volcanoes are married, what does one say to the other when it leaves? It says, lava. And if you need an explanation for that, then feel free to discreetly email me, and I'd be glad to explain what my 6-year-old son meant. It took me a moment to get it, but anyway, I think it's clever and cute for a 6-year-old. And if you want to meet my 6-year-old Braxton, you can refer back to the video I posted on my haiku site introducing you to my family virtually. But anyway, we are going to start off this with inflation. Um, Inflation is something that most students have heard of. If not, then it's okay. Many have not heard of it. But I would like to begin it with some political cartoons. Feel free to stop this video and examine the cartoons because, as I've mentioned to you before, each political cartoon tells a story. So this cartoon obviously shows a lady shopping. Her cart's labeled inflation, and if you notice, the farther she goes, the more she loses from her cart because of inflation. So that should give you one clue to what inflation is. Second one, cost of gas, 2004 versus 1984. Um, Not much explanation needed here, but obviously this shows that quite a bit more is spent filling up a tank of gas today than it was back in 1984. Actually, that's 2004, but even more so today. Next one. This cartoon again doesn't bear much explanation, but if you notice a couple things, obviously there's rat gnawing on money, so that gives you somewhat of a clue as to what inflation does to your hard-earned money. The rat is very fat. They're in the desert, and notice that the three gentlemen in the background aren't doing anything. That's because the artist's message is that many people are helpless to the costs of inflation. Another one involving one of my greatest fears, which is sharks. It was with much hesitancy that I posted this one on the PowerPoint. But this one, the shark represents inflation, and the person struggling to stay afloat is wages. Obviously, well, to be fair, most sharks don't bite people, but in this image, the inflation shark, obviously is about to take a nice big bite out of wages. And then finally, this one was done by my high school art teacher, who was a retired syndicated cartoonist for the Indianapolis Star, and his cartoons appeared in hundreds of newspapers throughout the country. His name is Gary Varble, upper left-hand corner. But this shows you that basically, if you look at the newspaper, greenback, which is another nickname for our money, our paper money, the value of it goes down because there's so much of it. It's no longer accepted, which has never happened in modern history, but he's using hyperbole to prove a point. Even at some point, becomes so worthless that even kids selling lemonade will no longer accept our dollar, which again has not happened, and I think most economists would agree that even with the situation we're in right now, that's not going to happen. So anyway, be assured of that. So inflation. Hope you might have gotten from the comics what inflation is, but it is a sustained rise in the level of prices. It's not just a minute, or it's not just, I'm sorry, week or even a year. It is a sustained raise in prices. I've told you before that my first job was at a movie theater in 1998 in Greencastle, Indiana, and for a opening night blockbuster movie on a Friday night, 7 o'clock, prime time, it cost around $5.50 a ticket. Now, costs you upwards of probably $12 plus, depending on how comfortable your seat is and how many D's in it, if it's 2D versus 3D, and all the other things. Um, so prices have gone up consistently for movie tickets. Same things with most items. If you look at this picture, it pretty much sums up inflation. You have $20 above each cart. In 1998, $20 could buy you all that. In 2005, $20 could buy you that. And then in 2013, as you can see, the cart's almost empty. Now, I don't necessarily believe that inflation is robbing you of purchasing power. It's something that isn't necessarily always a bad thing, as we'll see. But obviously, this picture gives it a very negative connotation. So you're going to be doing the inflation article after you finish the notes here. But there are two types of inflation, two main types. One can be decent as far as, good for an economy. Other one, rarely so. The first one is called demand pull inflation. This is ultimately caused by consumers. Consumers are the cause for this. Basically, consumers are getting money and they are spending it quickly. As I've told you time and again, in America, we are spenders. The more money we get, the more money we spend, generally. At a certain point, if there's people demanding more goods than are out there, we talked about this, when there's less supply of things, prices go up. Hence inflation. Demand pull inflation. This is a picture of the mayhem that happens on Black Friday, when people with money spend it left and right. And again, this is not always a bad thing, because our economy runs on pretty much demand. I mean, that's what we're seeing with our economy right now. Why it's struggling is because people are being told to stay inside and shelter in place, which is the right thing to do. But people are not demanding things from a lot of businesses they normally would, like restaurants and tourism and different what's considered non-essential businesses, which is causing the downturn in our economy. So if people do have demand or are demanding things, that means money is flowing through the economy. It can mean that people have money, and if people have money, that generally means they have an income, they have a job. So demand pull inflation, I think the average inflation in the United States is between 1% and 2% a year. That could be a healthy amount. It means people have money and are spending it. The second type is called cost push inflation, and this is rarely a good phenomenon. This is caused by some sort of price shock, where something occurs in the world that causes a much used resource to spike in prices. We talked about the 1973 oil crisis, where because we were siding with Israel in one of their wars with their Arab neighbors, OPEC, the group of countries mostly in the Middle East that control about half the world's oil, they cut off oil to us, so oil prices spiked. Well, if you can imagine, our world, even with all the alternative energy sources, still runs on oil. Much more so back then, and so everything that needed oil, from cars to farm machinery, therefore farm produce, to all other things, including military spending, went up. Prices spiked, and that caused cost push inflation, and that can cause, as we're going to see in the next slide, what's called a wage price spiral, which I'll go ahead and show it to you now. This is the wage price spiral. This from the 1970s. So if you look here, some sort of event that causes the price to skyrocket for a much used good. I mean, if you want to put, instead of oil, you can put something like plastic, because plastic's used in so much. And therefore, all the producers that use oil in their products, which is a lot, they have to raise their prices because it's more expensive to make their products, hence more expensive for consumers to buy it. Well, in order to pay for that, they raise prices. Therefore, consumers need more money to buy these goods. They go to their employers and ask for a raise. enough people ask for it and enough, collective bargaining, strikes being threatened through unions, they get their raise. Well, that means that producers have to raise their prices even more to make up for the money they're spending extra on their employees' salaries. So, and it just goes around from there until the price from the good that started it all, in this case oil, goes down, which when the war ended in 1973, the crisis was over. All right, so let's talk about the impacts of inflation, the different things that happen because of inflation. Now, obviously, the first one, the value of the dollar decreases. So the dollar is not worth as much as it previously was. Think of that picture from the first slide of the grocery carts with $20 above it. $20 is $20 is $20, but it's worthless if it can't buy you anything. I use this example a lot. If you're stuck on a desert island, no one there, no shops, no civilization, nothing there, and a plane full of money, millions of dollars washes ashore, that really doesn't get you very far because its purchasing power is zero, really. And so the value of the dollar decreases the more money is put in the economy. We've talked about this with supply, basic supply principle. The more you supply of something, the less it's worth. That applies to our currency, our money in the economy as well. This hits people with fixed incomes hard, people that don't get automatic raises. And this is just a side note. When you do, whether after high school or after college, are applying for your first jobs, and you get past the first interview where you basically make the cut, and in your second interview, and you're asking more questions. A great question you could ask, which is very telling, is whether they offer what's called cost of living increases, guaranteed every year. As I told you, inflation happens, it's about 1% to 2% a year. It's like gravity. It always eventually wins out. Therefore, if you're not getting a 1% to 2% raise every year, at least, you're actually getting a pay cut because your money you're making is actually purchasing less. So ask about cost of living increases. That's a good side note. So people like on Social Security, they don't always get cost of living increases. Now, every 5 to 10 years, they do some Social Security cost of living increases, but not every year. So if you're on just Social Security, you're losing money every year because of inflation. Second one is interest rates go up. It becomes more expensive to borrow money. And if you think of all the things that you borrow money on, that can really catch up with you, whether it be college loans, car loans, or the biggest, mortgage loans. I usually do this example on the overhead in class, but I'll just verbalize it to you. Basically, a $100,000 house, if you're paying it over 30 years, a 30-year mortgage, and your mortgage rate's around 4%, you'll actually end up paying about $170,000-ish for that house. So $100,000 for the house, and then $70,000 in interest back to the bank. The bank's making $70,000 off of you. Just a 0.5% interest raise. So instead of paying 4%, you're paying 4.5% interest rate. You will pay an extra $30,000 for that house. So even a small percent increase in interest can cost you quite a bit, as the example here with Fred also shows you. And then finally, decrease real returns on savings. So it's good to have a savings account. Your money's safe there. Matter of fact, it's probably safest in a savings account because even if the bank goes out of business, a tornado destroys the bank, people make a run on the bank and all the money's gone, your money is insured by the federal government, what's called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Company, up to $250,000. So if you have up to that amount in the bank, the government will repay you that amount. So it's very safe in a savings account. but it does not grow for the most part. I think the average is around maybe maybe 1/10, 1/2% of interest they pay you for putting your money in a savings account. And if inflation is 1 or 2%, you do the math, you're losing money every year. But again, you put it there because it's safe, not because you're trying to make it grow. If you want it to grow, you put it in a certificate of deposit, which we'll talk about in a later standard, or put it in the stock market, or you can buy bonds with it. We'll talk about those next standard as well. Given what you just learned about inflation, one of the things that we typically enjoy doing at the end of this class is what movies, when adjusted for inflation, actually earned the most money. For example, when movies first started coming out in the early 20th century, it cost like 10 cents for a ticket. It's not fair to compare those movies to today where it's $12 a ticket. So when you adjust for inflation, which movies made the most money, so sold the most tickets? And I'll give you a hint. Most ones we think about are not on there. Endgame is not quite there yet. Avatar is not in the top 10. Most of the Marvel movies are in the top 50, but they have not cracked the top 10 yet. So if you want to stop and try to guess, you can, but I will ruin the fun for you here in a moment. So off the top of my head, movies that made it in the top 10. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The Titanic made it in the top 5. The Exorcist made it in the top 10, as well as Jaws made it in the top 10. Number 3, I think, was E.T. Number 2, this had to be in there, Star Wars, the original New Hope, 1977. And number 1 from, the late 1930s, Gone with the Wind, the 3-hour plus long epic during the Civil War. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Get through the rest of the notes on inflation. So in this activity in your notes, take a look at each situation and decide whether they win or lose in that situation. So a family who just took out a mortgage on a new home, and they do not have a fixed rate mortgage, which means their mortgage, their interest rate can change with inflation. You can get a fixed rate mortgage, meaning that even if inflation goes up, your interest rate will always stay the same, but you need a pretty good credit score for that. And we'll talk more about credit scores again next standard. But in this situation, they lose because their interest can increase with inflation. Second one, landlords own a home that is fully paid off, that they currently rent out to other people. Well, all paid off, so they don't owe any money. They gain because prices go up. That means more money being paid to them for their apartments. And then finally, Lily, who was given a bond to pay for college from her grandparents. When she was 5, her grandparents put a $10,000 bond at 3% interest in her name. 2 decades later, she's ready to use it. But inflation has basically gone up by 5% during this time. Well, simple math, 3 minus 5, -2. So her bond has lost 2% of its purchasing power. So ultimately, they lose, but really Lily doesn't lose because it's a gift to her, but the bond loses. Okay, so how do we measure inflation? 3 things. We look at consumer price index, basically dozens of the most commonly bought goods like gasoline, houses, cars, eggs, bread, milk, things like that. And economists measure the percent change of each one of those, how much percent they've gone up from year to year or even quarter to quarter. Then they average it out, and that gives you the consumer price index. Producer price index is the same thing, except it's with things that producers use to make their products. And then the inflation rate is ultimately the rate at which prices have increased, which, as I told you, usually it's between 1 to 2% a year, so pretty manageable. Again, you think to yourself, can I reasonably ask for a 1 to 2% raise every year, and that's pretty manageable. Now, when it gets above 5%, then when wages can't keep up with it, then you run into problems, as we're going to see. This is the inflation rate in the United States from 1990 to 2019. As you can see, the highest it ever got to was 5.4%. There was actually deflation during the recession in 2008, 2009. Deflation, the lowering of prices, is never a good thing, as we'll talk about here in just a moment. This is inflation rate around the world. Interesting map. So blue, it's 0 or less than 0. Now again, that's not a good thing because that's deflation. It means prices are going down because people don't have money, they're not spending it. Green is the best because that's creeping inflation. It's inflation that's at a small rate. People can, keep up with it with their wages. No surprises there, really, as far as most of the world. And then when you get to 2.5 to 5.5%, not terrible, but you're getting into kind of some dangerous territory. Above 5%, orange, not good. Dark orange into the double digits, that's definitely a very bad sign. And then above 15%, that's critical. And here are the types of inflation. I mentioned one before. You have creeping inflation, which is a small rate of inflation, like 1 to 2 to 3, even below 5%. Galloping inflation, over 5%, even into the double digits, never a good thing. It means that usually means that you're not able to supply, your country is not able to supply for the wants of the consumers on a regular basis. And then hyperinflation, this is the crazy stuff, like you're going to watch a video, it's on the Haiku site of 1920s in Germany. They lost World War I. They're responsible for paying the cost. So they just started printing off marks, Deutschmarks, their currency, flooded the market with them. As I told you, the more you supply of it, the less it's worth. And you had crazy things like, newspaper costing 20 billion marks. The biggest case of hyperinflation that I ever heard of was in the 1950s or late 1940s after World War II, when the Soviet Union had taken over Hungary. If you, at a certain point before they basically their economy collapsed, if you took all of the paper money and coins in Hungary, all of it in the whole country put together, like in a room or in a house or something, and collected all the money in the country, it would be worth less than 1 US cent. That is the most extreme example that I can think of. Deflation, decrease in the general price level. Now you might think, hey, that's great. Prices going down because we like cheap prices. Bad news though, on the macro, the big view, this is always a bad thing. And it's typically a bad thing because if creeping inflation can mean that people have money or are spending it, deflation means that people aren't spending money. And the biggest reason why people aren't spending money is because they don't have it. Which, the next step on that, or next link on that chain, because people don't have jobs. Unemployment's up. So deflation usually happens in times of recession, times of unemployment. Poverty goes up. It wouldn't surprise me if this quarter or even the next quarter, over the next 6 months, there is some deflation in prices due to the financial stress we're having due to the coronavirus. This is called the deflationary spiral. So if deflation happens long enough, hard enough, it can be sort of the death spiral for an economy. So if you follow my cursor here, demand goes down. People aren't buying things because they don't have money. Well, producers have to lower their prices. Most shop owners, most producers are in debt to banks or investors, so they can't pay back their debt. So they have to close their doors. They have to go into bankruptcy, which means all of the employees that work for them lose their jobs, which gives them less money, which means they have less demand. And then the cycle just keeps on going and going and going. Now remember, in times of depression, which we haven't had since the 1930s, deflation was only for a few years, but that still was a pretty bad time in our economy. the last recession we had in 2008. Don't really know if what we're in now is going to be called a recession. They're arguing about whether it's a recession or not right now. But 2008, we only really had deflation for, maybe 6 months. So it didn't last that long. And if you look here, this gives you the deflation rate all the way from 1915 all the way up to the Great Recession of 2008. As you can see, a lot of inflation, huge inflation during World War I, lots of money being pumped into the economy in order to pay for military hardware, followed by the Great Depression, or actually kind of a short mini recession after World War I. Then came the Roaring '20s, then came the Great Depression, some years of deflation, and then some modest recovery from the New Deal programs, but the real recovery came when World War II happened in this era. So we began pumping money into the economy to create bombs and bullets and tanks and things like that. And then really there was a short trail off after World War II when we started downsizing our military, the main spender at the time. But then things kicked back up again because this whole period is known as the Cold War, when our military spending was the big engine of economic growth at the time. And then starting in the 1990s, inflation kind of leveled off. We've had pretty moderate 3% or lower for the most part inflation since then. Hello Econ students, welcome back to Standard 5. This is Mr. Stark. We are going to be talking about gross domestic product today, also known as GDP, which is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation in a given time period. Now, it's a fancy way for basically saying how much wealth a country has produced in a year, or even just in a quarter. This is one of the most popular methods to judge how wealthy a country, although by no means is it the only or even the best method to judge how a country's economy is. So, when you're counting all the things that count for a country's wealth, goods and services, those are both physical, tangible things that are made, and services that people do for each other for money, a couple things we got to keep in mind before we start actually getting into the nuts and bolts. First of all, it has to be a final good or service. It cannot be what's known as an intermediate good. For example, Colts t-shirt on the right. Okay, final good is the t-shirt, how much it's basically sold for. Intermediate good would be like the fabric or the dye or the logo. Those do not count as part of the GDP. So only the final cost or value of the t-shirt counts for gross domestic product. Couple other things that do not count for gross domestic product. One of them are known as non-market activities, and those are services that people do that typically you don't charge for, obviously. So, if I cook dinner tonight for my family, I don't charge them for cooking dinner. At least I better not. If I, watch my kids this morning while my wife does her work, I don't charge. At least I better not. So those do not count for gross domestic product. If you do your own repair, so like if your toilet breaks and you repair it yourself, you don't pay yourself for repairing the toilet. Although, if you have to buy supplies from Lowe's or Home Depot, the supplies you use do count, but the service, fixing it yourself, doesn't count for gross domestic product. And then also what's known as the underground economy. These are things that are not included. Basically, the way that GDP is calculated is part of it's through tax returns, reporting on ways you made money and things you spent. So, for example, drug dealing, illegal drug dealing. I'm not aware of any drug dealers who report their earnings on their taxes. That doesn't count. Also, plumbers or other service industries. You might hear maybe I don't want to pick on plumbers, but let's say an electrician comes in, does a job, and then tells you that I prefer to be paid in cash. Now, it might just mean they don't want to mess with credit cards or checks. It might mean that they want paid in cash because there's no evidence that they made that money. So when they file their taxes at the end of the year, let's say they actually made $100,000, but on their taxes, they put they only made $70,000. So they only pay taxes for $70,000 because if they got paid in cash, there's no way for the IRS to really prove that they made that extra $30,000. That's not always the case, but that's sometimes the case. And also jobs that you do that are not reported on taxes, like when you're 12 and you babysit for 20 bucks a pop, or you mow lawns, those typically aren't reported on taxes, although they're perfectly legal, but they're not reported on taxes, so those don't count either. So that's part of the underground economy. So if you get paid in cash to babysit, mow lawns, do other chores for neighbors, that is what I just said, the underground economy, because typically it's not reported on taxes, it's not counted towards the gross domestic product, which, if it makes you feel, if you feel any better, our gross domestic product is around $21 trillion a year. So, you know, the few $100s you made in the summer babysitting is not going to make or break our gross domestic product. So when you calculate or add up gross domestic product, there are 4 categories, and we're actually going to do some calculations here in just a little bit. But the 4 categories you have to add up. The formula at the top, simple addition, C plus I plus G plus X equals GDP. C is the consumption goods. These are standard household goods that people spend money on. Things like cars, gasoline, food, cleaning supplies. Then there's I, which stands for investment. These are goods that businesses or firms typically spend money on. So like factories, tools, inventory, which are like items that are not actually sold in the front store. They're items that are in the back that are waiting to be put out into the store. And houses. Houses are counted as inventory, which, by the way, houses only count for the gross domestic product when they're built and sold the first time. Reselling a house again and again does not keep adding to the gross domestic product. The third category is G, government spending. Government spends a lot of money, and what they spend money on counts for the gross domestic product. And then finally, net exports. Now, net means overall. So you have exports and imports. Exports are things you sell to other countries, you make money on. Imports are things you buy from other countries, you spend money on. So to get net exports, you have to subtract your imports from your exports. For example, if we export $10 billion to China, import $8 billion, well, we sold $10 billion, we bought $8 billion, our net exports, 10 minus 8, is $2 billion. Now, one of the things that's going to be critical when you add up gross domestic product is you can have negative net exports. So let's reverse that. Let's say we exported $8 billion to China, so sold $8 billion to China. We imported $10 billion from China. So we sold $8 billion, imported $10 billion. 8 minus 10 is negative 2. So our net exports is negative 2 billion. So it actually takes away from our gross domestic product. This shows you how it breaks down. So by and large, almost 70% of our GDP is what typical households spend money on. Government is 16.6%, and investment is 17.7%. And as you can see there, we actually lose money on exports. So we have what's called a trade deficit overall. We spend more buying from countries than we sell to countries, but it's still a very small part of our gross domestic product. All right, so I had to go back to this slide because I'm going to show you the rankings. Who has the most gross domestic product of any country? Hopefully you can see this. Well, originally I had planned to pull up a list of rankings of countries that had highest GDPs. I'll place links to those on the Haiku page, but it looks like it's not going to let me do that on the video here. There are hyperlinks embedded, so if you want to look at the actual PowerPoint, which is also in the Haiku page, You can see them, but we're number one by far. We produce about 1/4 of the world's wealth. So the world produces around $80 trillion of stuff a year. We're about 20 trillion of that. Second place by far is China. And then you go down to countries like India, Brazil, Germany, France, the UK, Russia. Those are some of the countries that round out the top 15. Obviously, large countries with large populations. The more people you have, generally the more people you produce. So, but if you pause and think, so like India, I think, is in the top 5 or 6. When you think of India, you don't think of a very strong economy. You think of a lot of poverty, even though they're in the top 10. So what that tells us is just looking at GDP by itself doesn't tell us really how good a nation's economy is, because you have to adjust for population, which is what this slide shows us. That's called per capita, per person. So basically you divide what your GDP was by population. So if our GDP overall was around 20 trillion, divided by about 315-ish million, that gives us between $55,000 and $60,000 per person. That's pretty good. It's not the best. We're not even in the top 10 anymore. Now, this is better because it shows you how each person's share of the GDP is. If we would look at India, who is number 5 or 6 on GDP, when they're adjusted for population, they're like 140th or like well past 120th place. Even our friend China, well, not really our friends, but our trade partners, China, they're well past 50th place when you adjust for population. And then, well, this shows you just this map. The big dots are just overall countries that have big GDPs. The dark blue are ones that have high GDP per capitas. There's not a lot of countries that are in blue and have big dots. We are, of course, one of them, followed by France, Germany, the UK, Japan. Now, there's 2 types of GDP before I get into the best value. You have what's called nominal GDP. That is GDP just flat out calculated how much you produce, the goods and services. So like in 1900, our nominal GDP was 20,766,000. Okay. Let's be honest, there are some marginal basketball players in the NBA who make more than that in a year. So that seems pretty low. If you adjust for prices the way they are now, because inflation, prices go up. So if you do the real GDP, it's more like $456 billion. Now, this concept, you have to figure in inflation. That's the difference between nominal and real GDP. Nominal does not take into account inflation, real GDP does. That's why Gone with the Wind is the #1 best-selling, most earning movie ever. Because although they, earned maybe 30 million in 1939, you adjust for today's ticket prices, that's like well over $2 billion. So you have to adjust for inflation. The image you might want to think of is think of a bag of chips. You take a bag of chips, you feel it, it feels full, you open it, there's 4 chips at the bottom, that's it. Well, what made it feel full? Air. You got to let the air out before you actually know how many chips are in the bag. Inflation is like the air in the bag of chips. You have to take that out of the equation in order to know actually how much you're earning. So for example, down here, short formula, nominal growth rate minus inflation rate is the real growth rate. So if you grew 10% in 1 year, that's like national celebration time. But if inflation was 9%, 10 minus 9 is 1% actual growth. The rest of it was just inflation. You didn't actually make anything more, just what you made went up in price. Hopefully that makes sense. And the best economic measure for growth using GDP is real GDP per capita. It takes into effect both inflation and population. And another list that I would like to look at, but you'll have to do it on your own with the hyperlink, the list of the best countries, the highest countries on the real GDP per capita, we're 11th. As of 2018, which is the last time They calculated fully GDP per capita, real GDP per capita. We were 11th. Number one was the tiny country of Qatar. Sounds like Qatar, but it's Qatar. Followed by Luxembourg and lots of other small countries, because although their GDP was fairly small, they have small populations, so each person got a big piece of the pie. So again, just having a big GDP doesn't tell the whole story. Hello, economics students. This is Mr. Stark. Today we are going to talk about two topics that are pretty appropriate and apropos for what's going on today in our economy, that of business cycles and unemployment. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. This starts on page 7 of your notes if you're following along in the outline that I provided for you. Cartoon time. So, political cartoons about business cycles. Again, each cartoon tells a story. There are no accidents or incidental details that don't matter in a political cartoon. So if you look, business cycles are portrayed as a roller coaster with two people riding the roller coaster, person in the back loving it, Wall Street being written on them, oftentimes representing the wealthier segment of our financial community. And up front, Uncle Sam looks like he's out of money. Next one. We have, it looks like Uncle Sam trying to fan the flames of economic recovery. This is obviously in the time of a recession or even depression. But as you can see, the water that's encroaching on the economic recovery is unemployment. So business cycles. Let's go ahead and get started with it. So our economy fluctuates. We have ups, we have downs. That's no surprise. But much like a sound wave, which is what it kind of looks like up here, our economies have peaks and troughs. When our economy is as good as it gets, and also when the economy is as bad as it gets. Called peaks and troughs. You have contraction when things are getting worse, things getting smaller, economy shrinking, and expansion when things are getting bigger, things are going well. So of the four phases in your notes, the expansion is a phase of economic growth. Things are going well, the economy is growing. That means our real GDP is going up, not just GDP, because inflation, remember the air in the bag of chips, could be driving it. But in this case, in an actual expansion, it is real GDP going up. More jobs, that's a good thing. More production, that's a good thing. The peak is things are as good as they're going to get for a while. If you can think of being on a roller coaster you've never been on, never heard of, haven't seen any drawings or plans for it, and you're blindfolded or it's in the dark. Most roller coasters start as with a big, slow, winding hill up. So if you're blindfolded and you have no idea what's coming, you really don't know you're done with that hill going up until you start going down. Likewise, we don't know where our peak is until we start going down. So yeah, we look back and say, oh yeah, that was as high as things were going to get. The peak is the highest point. Contraction, you're going down the hill. Things are getting bad. We are experiencing an economic contraction. We're in a contractionary phase. Now, you might hear the term recession thrown out. Technically, we are not in a recession because we have not been undergoing this type of economic climate for 6 or more months. My guess is, and most economists think, that we will see our economy shrinking for 6 months. That's 2 quarters. But whether it's going to be as bad as 08 or even a depression, which a depression is just a recession kind of on steroids, bigger, badder, stronger, we don't know. Although I would say that much in the way that we had to turn off our economy because of the coronavirus, in many ways, when we see the threat has passed or been mitigated, we can turn it back on. The question is, how long is it going to take for that light switch to finally actually ignite? We don't know. And in the trough, things are as bad as they're going to get. GDP's down, unemployment's up, people are losing jobs, things are not going very well. And much like the example of the peak, you don't know you're at the trough. You don't know you bottomed out until you start going up with an expansion. So a couple ways you can understand why business cycles happen. Business cycles are kind of like gravity. They're going to happen. Our economy goes in ups and downs in a wave form. One of the first one is aggregate demand. So there's our fun word demand. Aggregate basically means the entire economy. So all of demand in the whole economy. Is it up or down? As we talked about, you want demand up. You want people buying things. That means money's making its way around in the economy. So if you're in the downward phase of a business cycle, the contraction, it might be because your demand is down. People are not buying goods and services. That money's not making its way around the economy. Another one could be a supply issue. For some reason, a certain good or service that people are demanding just is not available, much like oil. 1973, we'll use that again. But aggregate supply is just the supply overall. This one today, the recession we're in is, if we want to call it a recession, is most likely, say, due to a demand. People can't demand because they're not able to leave their houses. At least most brick and mortar places don't have a lot of demand right now. So this is one of your challenge questions you're going to do on the Google form. So I will leave you to that. So we're back to our friends, the supply and demand graphs. So if you recall, you have demand goes to the dirt. So we have demand changing here. We have a supply line just to throw in there. Left is less, right is more. So in this case, demand is increasing. Okay. That means things are expanding when demand is increasing. New line to the right. Increase in demand means increased GDP, more money making its way into the economy. The economy is growing, right? On the other hand, we have a new demand line to the left. Left is less demand. Decrease in aggregate demand, so that means GDP is going down. The economy is shrinking. Not a good thing. Now, these two challenge questions are not on the Google Forms. We can do these together. So for number 2, which phase of the business cycle does this demonstrate? Well, you have left is less, right is more. Right is more here. Demand's going up. That means ... expansionary phase, which means GDP is increasing. So why? We've talked about what they are. Let's talk about why. Why does our economy fluctuate? Why does it have ups and downs and everything in between? Well, there's 4 main reasons. First of all, business decisions. Businesses can make really good or really bad decisions as a whole, which can ultimately affect our economy in big ways. I would say the 2008 recession was because of business practices, specifically banks and real estate firms were not doing good business practices, which caused our housing market to collapse temporarily. Another one, changing in interest rates. Remember, interest is how much extra you are charged for borrowing money. Low interest rates means more people are going to borrow money because it's cheaper to borrow money. Did I say rise? Lower interest rates, so a fall in interest rates means more people are going to demand loans and are going to borrow money, which they're going to buy more houses, they're going to buy cars with it, they're going to go to college, they're going to start businesses. If interest rates go up, that's going to cause less demand because fewer people are going to get loans to buy cars and houses and start businesses because they have to pay back more money because of that. Another one is consumer expectations, and this is an interesting one because this one, it's based on what consumers think is going to happen or is happening, not what's actually happening. So the best way I can explain this is through a non-economic example. Back in the 1950s, you had the book War of the Worlds by, I think, H.G. Wells, I think, 1950s. And before many people had TVs, authors would do book readings. So where they'd read their books on the radio, and people would tune in and listen to the authors reading the book. And Wells had a very authoritative, deep voice. War of the Worlds is a book about Martians from another planet coming to Earth, having superior technology, basically, walking all over our armed forces. I'm not going to tell you how it ends in case you want to read it. But people would tune into the radio, and if they weren't there at the beginning, when they said this is a book reading by H.G. Wells, they would tune in the middle, and they would hear things like Los Angeles being destroyed, or London being overrun by aliens, or Moscow being obliterated, and that would freak them out, understandably so. There were people who fled to the woods. People fled to their nuclear bomb shelters in the middle of the Cold War. There were even cases of people committing suicide because they thought the world was coming to an end, which it wasn't. It was a book reading, but people reacted to what they believed to be true, not what was actually happening. Same thing here. A large portion of people's information comes from the media or some sort of news media. That means the news media has a responsibility to give the straight up honest truth to people and not stoke panic when panic doesn't need to be stoked. Something that has been a lot talked about today with this pandemic going on. But anyway, consumer expectations. If people freak out, think the economy is going to go south, they don't spend their money, they hoard their money, they shack up and not go out and buy things, the economy could go down, even though that's totally not true what was being said. So anyway, and then the final one is external issues. This would be like what we're going through now, a pandemic or a natural disaster, a war. These can cause things to go badly. Contractionary phase of the business cycle, what we're in right now. This is another one of the challenge questions that's on the Google form. If negative events such as hurricanes, terror attacks, pandemics can cause recessionary phases, on the other hand, what are some things that could cause positive events that could cause expansions? So you need to answer that and explain why. Make sure you explain why the certain event that you're talking about could lead to an expansion or better economic conditions. This gives you a little bit of a chart as to what are some things that can cause demand or supply side on the economy to increase or decrease. Economic expansions brought about by all these different things can cause economic expansion. In history, the Great Depression was the largest trough, the largest contraction we had. 1 in 4 people were unemployed, probably more than that now that we've done research on it. Real GDP declined by 1/3. And then an expansion, the New Deal and World War II. The New Deal by itself really didn't get us out of the Depression. It did some progress in getting some people back to work. It really wasn't until World War II happened that a lot of things happened. A lot of the unemployed men were drafted or joined the military, shipped overseas. A lot of industries that were not producing much were kicked into gear, like Ford and Chrysler, to produce tanks and bombs and airplanes and uniforms and such, where industries got going. And our country took out massive loans to build up these sectors of our economy. All of that together led to us getting out of the Great Depression. Really, post-World War II, one of the largest economic booms we've seen. So again, I would say on our current business cycle, I would say 2 months ago, I would place us on this expansion. Ever since 2010, when we reached the trough of the housing crisis from 2008 to 2009, 2010, all the way to a few months ago, we were growing. We were on expansionary phase, a almost 10-year expansionary phase. Well, we reached our peak a couple months ago. Now that we can look back and see, the stock market started going down. Businesses had to shut down. People are losing jobs by the hundreds of thousands. So we are definitely in a contractionary phase or recessionary phase. It will probably become a recession after it's done that for 6 months. But like I said, unlike the housing market crash where we just kind of had to wait it out and just wonder when is it going to turn around, well, it could turn around for the United States this time as soon as us just lifting the ban, whenever the health professionals and economists can decide when that's appropriate, and that could cause our economy to do a quick shift to an expansionary phase again? We don't know. Another challenge question. Given what we just learned about the business cycle, what should be the consumer's attitude about the future? So where we are right now. Good news, bad news. If you're in an expansion, it's good news and bad news. Good news is life's good, GDP is going up, more jobs. Bad news is it's not going to last forever. Recessionary phase, the opposite. Things stink, people are losing jobs, there's uncertainty. The good news, it's not going to last forever. Every recession comes to an end, every expansion comes to an end. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. And then number 6, with that being said, presidents, and I mean presidents from all the way, back since Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, have basically capitalized on economic expansions or booms. So for example, if there's an economic boom going on, the current president oftentimes will take credit for it, claiming that their policies are obviously working because the economy is doing well. If you're unlucky enough to be president during an economic decline, you do whatever you can to try and point to someone else, because you don't want to have to take the blame for the economy going south. But based on what we learned about business cycles, how accurate is it for presidents to claim success or be blamed for the economic situation? And I'll leave it there. So unemployment. You guys have an article you need to read. Obviously, those are on textbook pages. Those are old school textbooks. But we are going to talk about unemployment. So I'll give you a second to read that, or actually not a second, hopefully some time to read over the short article, fill in the notes, and we're going to go over them. All right, so unemployment. Now you might hear unemployment or the unemployment rate, like for example, currently it's 4.4%. That does not mean that 4.4% Americans don't have jobs. As you should have read, unemployment rate is the number of people working age, students are not included, so you're not included in that, who do not have a job, but, and this is the big but, are currently looking for a job. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, they every month interview 60,000 households, which is a little over 100,000 people, and ask them this question: do you have a job? If you do not, are you looking for a job? If so, then they would count for the unemployment rate. So right now it's 4.4%, or it was for March. That means 4.4% of Americans who can work and are looking for a job cannot find one. Now, some people that do not count in that 4.4. First of all, you have what's called discouraged workers. These are workers who've dropped out. They want a job, but they've quit. They've looked and looked, and they've just quit. That does not count for the unemployment rate. Another one is underemployed. These are workers that have skill sets that are well above where they're working. For example, a doctor working at Burger King, or someone with a PhD working at Starbucks. That would be underemployed. That does not count on unemployment either. If you're in the military, that counts as an occupation, as well it should be. Prisoners do not count on the unemployment list either. So those things do not count. Hopefully you read about the different types of unemployment, structural, cyclical, just had a brain freeze for a second, structural, cyclical, frictional, and seasonal. So we're going to go through those. So first question, Carl's a stay-at-home dad. He is happy to stay at home to take care of his children and is not looking for a job. Does he count as one of the unemployed on the unemployment rate? The answer should be no. He is not currently looking for a job, so he does not count as unemployed. Number 2, amongst Mark's 10 friends, 3 of them are unemployed. Does this mean that our unemployment is 30%? Obvious answer, no. Again, the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys 60,000 households a month. And then finally, Jackie has a bachelor's degree in English and works as a sales clerk at Macy's. Although she continues to apply for jobs related to her degree, she has no luck. Is Jackie discouraged or underemployed? If you're saying underemployed, you are correct. She has a job. She's not unemployed. She's not discouraged. She didn't drop out from looking for a job, but she is working at a job below her skill set. So let's take a look at the different types of unemployment with some situations here. So frictional, seasonal, structural, and cyclical. So first of all, this type of unemployment is related to entering a contractionary phase of the business cycle. So because the business cycle is going into an expansionary or contractionary phase, that means less jobs. That would be cyclical. Next one. This type of unemployment is related to not having the appropriate skills. So in other words, you want to get a job as a doctor, but you've never been to med school. Well, that would be structural unemployment. Number 3, temporary or voluntary. So you don't like your boss, you need to go back to school. That would be frictional unemployment. And number 4, I'm sorry, not just number 4, there's another one after that, but number 4, technology causes you to be laid off. So you work at a Chrysler automobile plant, and for 30 years, you put together the axles of cars on an assembly line. That's all you do. Well, unfortunately for you, Chrysler invents a machine that does it cheaper, quicker, more accurate. Don't have to pay it, don't have to give it vacation days, and so you are laid off. Your skills are now obsolete. That is also structural unemployment. And then number 5, this type of unemployment is related to changes in the season. So if you're an outdoor pool lifeguard in Indiana, chances are you are seasonally unemployed right now. As I give this lecture, it just starts sleeting outside. It's a balmy 45 degrees, so definitely too cold for swimming outside. If you're a department store Santa, you are probably also seasonally unemployed right now. So that is the end of unemployment. So make sure you do the challenge questions, asking about unemployment. Feel free to rewind this as much as you want. Also, there's a lot of really good videos on YouTube. There's a crash course video about unemployment, what it is and what it isn't. We are going to be seeing unemployment rates going up in the coming several months due to these businesses having to shut down. Again, not really good news, but the less bad news is when this quarantine or this shutdown is reversed, these businesses can get back up. And the government's giving out, not giving, but lending and giving grants of trillions of dollars to keep businesses kind of on life support until we can flick the switch and people can then go to restaurants and go to brick and mortar stores and such. So that's kind of what's happening and what's coming down the pipe in the coming weeks and months. I hope you all are doing well. Hang in there. We'll get through this. Again, every recession comes to an end. So I will talk to you next time.